Matthew, can you talk about the state of the race right now? We should at this point ignore polls. We can't help it. It's like the crack cocaine of people, for people like us.
I'd say there's some interesting polls.
Polls. Today there are a whole bunch of polls out. The president has a nominal lead in the national polls, although that really doesn't matter because this is not going to be a national election. It's going to be 50 state elections. We know the drill here. But in a lot of those states that we're told matter, president's got a couple-point lead, including, to my mind, amazingly, as of this morning, NBC Marist has him ahead in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what do you read these polls to mean in terms of where this, and what do you think the state of the race is offline from the polls?
Well, I think that this is an interesting race because there's a lot of conflicting data that points at one hand in the direction that Mitt Romney should be elected president, and in the other hand it points the direction that Barack Obama should get elected president. And I don't say ignore the polls because when at this period of time, in most of these presidential races, where the things stand about right now is most of the time, unless there's some big disruption, where they end up on election day. The American public starts to sort of focus, they get a sense of who these people are, and then they sort of lock in, or they sort of begin to receive information through that prism. So if they've decided they will get Obama, then everything they receive goes through that prism. To me, if you look at the wrong track numbers, the consumer confidence numbers, and the economic data, you would say Mitt Romney should be elected president.
Right.
If you look at the favorability numbers and who's likable and a sense of who the country supports on various issues, then Barack Obama should get reelected president of the United States. So the environment says Mitt Romney, the aspects of their personalities and the aspects of who they are, say President Obama. The interesting thing to me about the states, and I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, different than 2000 is, this is a dynamic in this race. Right now, the Electoral College, unlike it, has begun to move as more of an advantage for Democratic candidates for president, and that was not true. It's now more, the Electoral College, in my view, is now much more of a Democratic advantage. And if you look at this race, if this race, there is a possibility that Barack Obama could lose the national popular vote and win the Electoral College.
Well, you guys have some experience with that. You've been there before.
And that's how much this has changed from 2000, when there was an electoral advantage for a Republican. In 12 years, or 8 to 12 years, it's now turned into an electoral advantage for the president, and that has to do with people's patterns of movement, the economies in the key target states, all of those factors. That's why I think I still think this race is on one of those razor's edge, and next week, if the jobs report comes out and it's bad, it could tilt in Romney's favor, and it depends on what happens, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in healthcare today, and it could tilt in Romney's favor or Obama's favor. So we're on that razor's edge, but I'd have to say those dynamics that I just mentioned and the Electoral College give a slight advantage to President Obama.
Mark, what's interesting is in a number of those states where the president is a couple of points ahead and where his favorability is on the right side of it, right?
Yeah.
They also think that the country is on the wrong track. We have an interesting phenomenon where you have states in which more people think the economy is on the wrong track than the right track, but they still support the president over Romney. What's that tell you?
Well, part of it is that in those swing states, ironically, in a majority of those states, the right track for the state's actually good. The economy's doing pretty well. They got Republican governors who are standing up, who don't want to say the economy's bad in their state, so they have Republican governors in places like Ohio that are defending the economy
Florida,
in those states.
Right.
But what I thought was interesting about the polls in the last few days is this. One thing we're really familiar with is what David Plouffe calls bedwetting, when all your supporters start whining about your strategy and coming unglued, or and the sky is falling and your communication, your messaging's all screwed up. Well, it's classic physics in a campaign, and good campaigns really resist that. And they, as we did, one of the things we talked about in 2004 was that we set a strategy early on and we never deviated from it, despite a lot of pressure to deviate. We had a national security strategy. Abu Ghraib blew up in the middle of that, and everybody was like, oh my God, you can't have a national security, so you've got to shift. So our view was that even a imperfect strategy that was consistent was better than a strategy that tried to adapt to the changing environment all the time. The critics, well, that's classic case of what's happening with the Obama campaign. They sort of set off on a very clear Bain strategy where they were attacking the Bain and the outsourcing and offshoring and what have you. It got a lot of criticism from the punditry and that it wasn't working, it was the wrong message.
And from some Democrats.
Yeah, and from a lot of Democrats.
President Clinton.
President Clinton.
A lot of Democrats who have private equity interests.
let's acknowledge the self-interest of those people. But they stuck
But
with
the
it.
point is,
Yeah.
these polls that just came out showed in those states where they're running with that message, they have opened up a considerable lead.
Right. In many of the swing states, particularly, it's working.
That's right.
It's working.
Especially states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. I think there's now a 9-point lead in Ohio, 8 points in Pennsylvania. And I would contend that Pennsylvania is really not a swing state, actually.
Right.
I think that's full scope.
Although you guys always say,
We always
say, oh, we can
we
get
get something.
Pennsylvania, and then in the end it ends up being
Forget
11. But John, do you agree with Matthew that the Electoral College these days tends to be an advantage Democrat?
Obviously, for all the reasons
Yeah.
that Matthew talked about. And I read his piece about the possibility the president could achieve a popular vote defeat but win the Electoral College. I think that's exactly right.